Is it a turning point? After weeks of warning of a counteroffensive in the south, Ukraine catching the Kremlin off guard with the reclaiming of vast swathes of the north, pushing the front away from the country's second city, Kharkiv. We'll be asking, well, what just happened? Whether there's more to come, or if Kyiv's going to struggle to consolidate those newfound gains, as you can see by this map. And then, of course, there's Russia's response. Already the Ukrainians are accusing Moscow of targeting civilian power and water installations as retribution for this stunning setback. What will Vladimir Putin do to reverse course and keep his promise to leave most Russians out of a so-called special military operation that is now in its 200th day? Will he stick to his pledge to spare fighting-age citizens conscription? More broadly, how does the master of the Kremlin keep a lid on it all? Today in the France 24 debate, are we witnessing a turning point? Joining us from Kyiv, he's a leading advisor to President Zelensky of Ukraine, Alexander Rodnyansky. Thank you for being with us. Alexander Rodnyansky, assistant professor of economics at Cambridge University. We're as well with retired General Michel Yakovlev, formerly Vice Chief of Staff at NATO's European Allied Command Operations. Today, in civilian clothes, a professor at the Paris School of International Affairs. Thanks for being with us. He's just back from Ukraine. France 24 senior correspondent James Andre. In particular, you've been watching the crisis unfolding on the front line where there's Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. More on that, perhaps, a little bit later. And we'll be joined in a moment by Oleg Kobzev, associate professor at the American University of Paris, the France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yet the swing in momentum is palpable, with Ukraine now claiming that its forces have moved within 50 kilometers of the Russian border northeast of Kharkiv. And at the same time, Ukrainians struggling to restore power after those attacks on infrastructure installation overnight, attacks that have been categorized by the locals as retribution for this stunning shift in momentum. Shanine McCausland has more.
Fires engulfed a thermal power plant in Kharkiv after Russian strikes in the northeastern city on Sunday. The attacks reportedly left 9 million residents without power and water in northeastern and central Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces had only targeted civilian infrastructure.
A missile struck an infrastructure site, damaging important machines. 2 people were in the building. We found one who was killed, and we're trying to find the second.
Kyiv condemned the attack as a retaliation over Moscow's losses in the east. In a crucial pocket of northeast Ukraine, Russia's front lines collapsed in recent days, losing key northeastern cities to a surprise Ukrainian counter-offensive, including Kupiansk, Balaklia and Izium, a gateway to the highly contested Donbas region. Because of their retreat, Russian forces left behind a critical logistics hub in Izium, containing ammunition stockpiles and equipment.
The main square of Izium, the local administration building, is still burning. Everything around is destroyed. But it's okay. We will restore everything. Izium was, is, and will be Ukraine.
As the Ukrainian military claims to have retaken 3,000 square kilometers of land, the Russian Defense Ministry is framing their retreat as part of their strategy meant to reinforce its position in the eastern Donbas region. Meanwhile, on the southern front, Ukraine continues to push against Russian forces near Mykolaiv and Kherson, where the country's military is making modest gains.
Okay, as promised, we have Oleg Kobzev of the American University of Paris. Thanks for being with us. I want to thank welcome as well from Vilnius, formerly Moscow-based political science, Alexandra Filipenko. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. I want to begin with you, General Yakovlev, just to talk about what's the surprise for many. For weeks, they'd been, we're going to attack Kherson, that's in the south of the country. We're going to attack Kherson. And then the bulk of the operation happens in the northeast. Were you surprised?
Well, to be honest, I didn't have any knowledge of the plan. So yes, I was surprised. Now, I'm not surprised by the fact that the Ukrainians are demonstrating a high level of in the art of war, and they've been very playful. They played a great deception plan. I have a suspicion they'll go on playing the northern card for as long as it achieves good returns, and when it will stiffen, they'll attack, put more pressure elsewhere. What I have not been surprised about is the crumbling of the Russian army. For months, I've been saying that this is a demoralized army that has long culminated, that does not want to fight this war, and when it will get under serious pressure, it will crumble. So in that respect, no, I'm not surprised.
Not surprised, and there was those attacks, and Ukraine accuses the Russians of deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure with power going out overnight, water going out overnight in Kharkiv. Is that what the Ukrainians should expect?
Well, they'll expect more of the same. It's not the first time that the Russians have targeted civilian infrastructure in complete disregard of, the rules of law and basic humanity, by the way. But it also shows that Putin is short of options, because everything that he's doing now, he has done already. So he may spring us another Kinjal or another, marvelous tool, and we'll say, we've been there already. There's nothing more he has. And his concern now is survival, his own survival.
His own survival. I want
Yes.
to get back to that point. But first, let's talk about this moment. Ukrainian forces, they've been tweeting photos and videos from what appears to be the center of Izium, the Donbass city, an important command and supply hub for Russia's northern front. And the French news agency AFP is there. What they found is a lot of desolation. Yeah, an estimated 80% of buildings are damaged. However, morale very high among residents.
Yesterday morning there were Russians, this morning Ukrainians. It's not enough to say I'm happy. I just don't have the words to express myself.
This morning, 2 vehicles arrived on the street where we live. We met them with tears in our eyes. We were waiting for them to come. We could not imagine that they would come so unexpectedly. We have been waiting for them for almost half a year. We are so happy.
Alexander Rodnyansky, your thoughts listening to those residents of Izium?
Yes, well, it's a great moment. We've been waiting for it several months. We've expected that it would come. We were saying from the get-go that we would be successful in our counter-offensive and that the Russians would not sustain the war effort as they did early on, especially as would be receiving support from the West, increasingly more weapon systems as we have been receiving. And so that played its role. So ultimately, yes, this is a big moment for us, and we hope that it's going to continue. The plan is to press on, to push on, to return all the territories that have been occupied. And ultimately, this will lead then to a collapse of the Russian regime, and then to a chance at long-lasting stability and peace yet again in the region.
A collapse of the Russian regime?
Absolutely. That's the beginning of their end. I mean, it always has been. They were never able to subdue Ukraine or achieve whatever they wanted to achieve in Ukraine. And so the ultimate solution to this war, you have to remember, is the collapse of the Russian regime. There's not going to be any peace, any long-lasting settlement or agreement with the current Russian regime. And so as soon as we'll be successful and victorious in this war effort, that will be the real beginning of the end for the Russian regime.
Oleg Kopsev?
I agree with him. But what worries me is the reaction when Putin and those who supported him in this war realize that their regime is collapsing. What are they going to do then? And we just had a conversation.
Are we getting ahead of ourselves, though?
I'm afraid we are also. Let's calm down and look at the situation. The territories that have been regained by the Ukrainians it's not a big deal. It's what, 30,000 square kilometers.
3,000.
3,000.
Yeah, 3,000.
Well, 3,000. 3,000 is nothing. Even 30,000 would have been nothing compared to the magnitude of the Ukrainian territory, which is far greater than France.
The front line runs some 1,800 kilometers.
Exactly. So this reminds me a bit. Although there are differences with World War I, you would take the Douaumont fort and then it was taken back. What will happen tomorrow? It might be those territories might be taken back. We have to wait and see. I think let's not get ahead of ourselves. Or if indeed the Ukrainians continue their advance, the general will tell me if what is actually possible, if it could be done quickly. But there's another scenario. They will not be done quickly. It will go just very, very slowly. They will be hopping ahead like the Americans in World War II from island to island. It will last several years. But again, I want to return to what worries me the most. What if indeed things go fast? What if indeed the regime starts collapsing? What will Putin do when he realizes that his whole strategy is falling apart? And could he do something absolutely extreme and extremely dangerous for world peace?
I want Alexandra Filipenko to answer that, but first, let me ask you, James Andre. Just remind our viewers, you're back some 10 days ago from
last Monday.
Last Monday,
yeah, so a week ago, and
lots happened since.
Yeah, a lot has happened since, and it's interesting because actually I saw not the beginning of this operation, because basically what happened was we started out in Kyiv because it was the 6 months of the war, and so what we saw there was it's actually very interesting. Very quickly, Kyiv has come back, maybe not to what it was before the war, but things are rather calm and people are living,
cafes
peacefully.
are open.
Cafes have opened, restaurants have opened. I remember, being there in March, and it was a very, very different picture. But then we moved down to Zaporizhzhia, so for the power plant and for the IEA visit, and we tried to go to Kherson at the time. We thought, right, this is where it's happening because this was where the big offensive was announced. And we were met with strategic silence and the fact that we were not allowed to go to Kherson or anywhere close to Kherson, and also wondering, what was going on. And indeed, it now appears clear, yes, this was not a distraction, but at least, a strategic message for the Russians, which we now see that, in fact, this offensive was up north. And that, of course, is very interesting because at that stage, things felt like a stalemate. And I think maybe you're right, it's only 3,000 square kilometers. But what I find remarkable is that it is, it's a victory. It appears to be a change in momentum, even though we're still talking about a small area. I was speaking to a friend of mine in Ukraine.
There are Russian speakers on both sides. How could Russia's military intelligence have been caught on the back foot?
Well, that's remarkable. That does show that indeed this operation has been very well planned. I mean, I was reading reports about the fact that the Ukrainians knew what time the Russian satellites were going over, that there was very little, intelligence on the other side of the line. And actually, this is very interesting because I spoke to one of my friends in Ukraine, and he was telling me he's in Irpin, close to Kyiv, and he was telling me all his friends and himself were very moved by the fact that these soldiers, because these are the videos that have been shared in Ukraine, were being welcomed by the local population in these areas that were, prior to 2014, very pro-Russian, Russian-speaking. Indeed, things have shifted after 2014, and they've shifted further. Clearly, the soldiers were being welcomed in these villages, and that is something that was very important for the rest of Ukraine to see. He was also telling me that, of course, he knows quite a lot of things about strategy. He was telling me that he is worried to see that, yes, there's been this long-pronged advance, but now you need to hold that territory, and he does believe that the Russians will probably try and fight back.
I don't think it's possible. Actually, I don't think we should be too concerned about the numbers of square kilometers. That's a very Western way of seeing it. We think in terms of real estate. In the Russian art of war, it's a force-on-force story. It's how much blows you deliver, virtually irrespective of the territory liberated in this case. What this has shown is that the Russian forces, when under pressure, crumble, that they have no reserves. There is no reserve wherever in theater. Even if they had, their desire to fight is zero. So the ability, on the basis of the current force of Ukraine, the ability for the Putin regime of actually reversing the drive, the momentum, is zero. In the foreseeable future, they'll just go on taking blows until the Ukrainian offensive expends its logistics reserves.
And Izium is very strategic. It's a vital supply line. So it is a very important strategic gain.
Alexander Filipenko, whether or not this is a turning point, we're talking about who's winning and you heard it there from James Andre a moment ago, who's winning the battle of public opinion. And it, of course, depends on how it's all being spun. Now, you left Moscow back in July, so you've got a keen sense of how we really are in parallel universes when the story of this war is being told.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the last thing I want is to contradict Mr. Rodnyansky or anyone at the distinguished panel. But since I'm the one who recently managed to get out from Moscow, I must say that I'm not that optimistic, maybe, regarding the regime. And because I've seen how the propaganda works, and the only thing that Kremlin was actually very successful in all those years is propaganda. That's the only thing. It is great that we can see those amazing pictures and images and documentary videos from liberated cities and everywhere in Ukraine, that Ukrainians are so happy. And that's what Kremlin wanted to see. That's what Kremlin was expecting when invading Ukraine. But I want to make just 2 points regarding the regime. It's first of all, we all remember that it's a nuclear power. And the other thing is that how Putin might spin it. Because one idea came to me that he might say something like the special operation revealed a lot of shortcomings that need to be resolved, and we have to carry out reforms and repressions in the army and special services and civil services in general. And I must take the power in my hands, and I'll be running for the next term. Russia needs my experience, et cetera, et cetera. And since most Russians are listening to propaganda, to TV channels, and that's the only way they learn the news, because we know that all opposition channels are banned, and everyone who speaks out is either a foreign agent or something like that. And in order to get news in Instagram, you need to have VPN, et cetera, et cetera. And I just watched yesterday's evening show on Channel 1. It's the main propaganda channel. And they constantly emphasize that it's the Donetsk and the Luhansk republics that are at war with Ukraine. And in that segment of 8 minutes, they mentioned Donetsk and Luhansk republics 13 times, and Russia, regarding the special military operation, just twice. So in other words, it seems that Russia has nothing to do with it. So that's how they're trying to spin it. And the other thing, sorry for taking so long, but the other thing is now when Ukraine is taking city by city and liberating city by city, what Russian Defense Ministry is doing at this point, today they make a historic decision to restore Soviet military monuments that were dismantled in other countries like Lithuania, where thankfully I am right now. So what timing, it's certainly so timely. So they are trying to spin it in their way. And so that's why I'm not that optimistic, but maybe it's because I'm on this side of the fence for just a little less than 2 months.
Alexander Rodnyansky, your thoughts on this?
Yes, well, I actually have a few comments to everything that was said, with all respect. So, I mean, we also know Russia really well. In fact, I belong to the group of advisors that know a lot about Russia really over the years. And we can tell you there's many ways that a regime can collapse. And it's not just a popular uprising. So while I'm also not optimistic about Russia's transition to a real democracy in the short term, that's obvious, that's not going to happen. I am more optimistic when it comes to a military defeat leading to some sort of turbulences in terms of how much power this regime will still have. There could be a palace revolt. The military is hugely humiliated. It's demotivated. It is a huge blow to their morale, obviously. And this is not something that is easy for a dictatorial regime, as the current Russian regime, easy to stomach. So this is a perilous situation in which the current Russian leadership is in. It's not going to get any easier. And by the way, another comment regarding the 3,000 square kilometers. Remember, this is in 5 days, and it's twice the size of Greater London. And it's more than Russia managed to capture in the last 5 months of Ukrainian territory. So this is actually quite a bit of territory that we're winning back at a very high pace. So, these are just some comments. I will also say there was another comment regarding Russian intelligence and its quality. We're actually not surprised that it's so bad. I mean, Russian intelligence has been bad over the years. You saw what happened within Russia. They weren't even able to subdue their own opposition. They tried to poison Navalny, and everybody saw that they did it and how they did it. So they're not very professional when it comes to any sort of operations, and especially in Ukraine. I mean, they basically got everything wrong that they could possibly get wrong in Ukraine. So no surprise.
But there is, permit me for saying this, there is one point there made by Alexander Filipenko, which is that one thing that does work well, and we see it when we watch the French and the English language versions of Russian state television, is they're good at getting their message across. How are you getting your message across? And just honestly speaking, Alexander Rodnyansky, how successful are you in broadcasting Ukraine's message across the border?
Yes, well, look, we don't have to. I think fundamentally, getting your message across depends on having truth on your side. You can manipulate, you can think about the tactics, the strategies, the communication techniques that you apply as much as you want, but as long as it's based on some fallacy, on some lie, you're not going to have permanent, long-lasting success at convincing anybody. And we have success at convincing the world and our partners, not because we're so effective at using some strategies, but because we have truth on our side. We're defending our country, and that's the fundamental reason. And I will disagree with the fact that Russians are so good at it. They have been good at it over the years internally in spreading their propaganda, but they will not be good at this for as long as they suffer defeat and the more losses they count.
Michel Yakovlev, we see right now in Africa, in a lot of French-speaking Africa, people using the talking points of Russian media and criticizing the French. They seem pretty good at it.
Yes, and successful for a number of reasons. But to go back to this one, I fully agree with Alexander. And there's one thing. The reality is that apparently the population in Russia is tuning away from TV. Apparently their audiences have crashed, and they've had to start putting entertainment again in the normal programs. So the degree of exposure to that propaganda is starting to wear people down.
Alexander Filipenko?
Well, on the one hand, I absolutely agree. Yes, they're putting back the some entertainment shows. But in those shows, they also use propaganda. They also sing some propaganda songs and horrifying, absolutely horrible poems about President Zelensky and about Ukrainians. So they are using the propaganda even in those shows. So I would love to be more optimistic regarding that, and I would love to, but still not so sure. But I hope that probably when I would agree with Mr. Rodnyansky that the more there is defeat, the less there is propaganda, the less successful is propaganda.
I'd like to ask Alexandra one question. How about, because we've been having reports here that some very vocal people like Ramzan Kadyrov has been criticizing the military operation in Russia. We've also heard that
Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the head of the Russian-backed
Chechnya,
exactly. And also Igor Girkin, and he was known under the name Igor Strelkov, and he was one of the architects of the first military operation in 2014. And he's been coming out in blogs saying that this military operation was a disaster. And I was wondering if, Alexandra, you believe that this could have any pull in Russia, because these are people who are, well known over there as well.
Yes, I would say that especially Mr. Kadyrov has a special say. Let's put it this way, because he has he's very popular he has his own, let's say, TikTok brigades, that's how we call them. That's his fighters, his infantrymen that have been traveling around and filming some videos, some propaganda videos. So they are quite popular in Russian Z channels, YouTube and Telegram and TikTok. So especially Mr. Kadyrov's words might have some weight. But again, we all know that Kadyrov is always firmly behind Putin, and he always supports Kremlin. And maybe this is the way to get closer to the Kremlin, because he recently said that it's time for him to leave Chechnya. It's time for him to stop being the head of Chechnya, and he needs to step down. So maybe he just does it to get closer to Moscow, if he still believes that Russia will stand.
Michel Yakovlev?
Yes, if I may, a rebound on what you said, Alexandra, about yesterday mentioning 13 times the Donetsk republics and twice. Well, it may be bad news for the Donetsk republics, because it may be the beginning of a message whereby it's their defeat. And we're not involved. Ultimately, we're not involved. And we're very sorry that you lost your war, my friends. It has nothing to do with us, and we walk home. This may be, you know, I suggest we go on seeing the evolution of that. And maybe the beginning.
That's said that the situation is very dire in the Donetsk.
And we're talking about parallel universes. As the world wondered about Russia's biggest battlefield setback since April, when it had to pull out of areas north of the capital, Moscow this weekend was throwing a party. The city celebrating its 850th birthday, and for a smiling Russian president, it all sounded like business as usual.
Moscow is rightfully considered one of the most beautiful and comfortable megacities in the world. And every year, it confirms its competitiveness at a global level, including in attracting talented and energetic people, with an increasing pace of economic, infrastructural and social changes.
So, Alexander Rodnyansky, on the one hand, you could say it sounds a little diluted. On the other hand, you can also say Russia's a big place. It's got oil and gas. It can weather the storm.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's not going to do it. I mean, it's obviously delusional. It's obviously Russian propaganda. It's obviously an attempt to distract from what's happening, to deflect from the defeats. I mean, I really think that the Russian regime is in a very dire place. I mean, it's really starting to crumble in some sense internally, even if, you know, a revolution is far off. But look, I mean, the economy is in shatters. It will be in shatters, even though the collapse is not as steep as we've had it. But remember, Russian automobile production, for example, is down almost, you know, entirely. There's basically no production whatsoever in the automotive industry. And this is going to get worse because all the intermediate imported inputs that Russia used to source from abroad, that it was heavily dependent on for any type of technologies they produced, especially in the military segment, they're not going to get anymore, and they're not going to be able to, you know, substitute away from those easily. So the long-run economic prospects of Russia are very bad. They're dire, and this is going to drag on, and it's going to be increasingly more difficult for the regime to explain why living standards are on a downward trend without any success stories.
And since the beginning of the war, we've been wondering this question, Oleg Kobzev, which is outside of the liberals that live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. People are used to things breaking down and an existence that's difficult at times.
That's true, and that's why I'm in the more pessimistic camp with Mrs. Filipenko. There's a big difference between Soviet propaganda that we seem to think that today it's still the good old Soviet propaganda with brainwashing. But the big difference with today is that in the old days, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn used to say, they are lying. We know that we know that they are lying. They know that we know that they are lying. But today, the difference is that people are lying to themselves.
How so?
Because they have good reasons for it, to think that they have been punished for actually liberating themselves from communism. And I'm sorry to say this next to a NATO general, but NATO has been very much responsible in just pushing and pushing and pushing as far as possible its limits into Eastern Europe. That has created a nation of people who are paranoid and absolutely willing themselves to listen to Putin. Putin is the result of a lot of Russian paranoia, due to also to the fact that, unfortunately, the model of democracy that came after the totalitarian regime was a complete chaos for 10 years until Putin came as a sheriff. That's the problem. There's still 50% of people who were voting for Putin before the elections were completely rigged, as they are now.
And he's still a popular guy,
So,
Alexander.
yes, and that's
Filipenko.
what worries me.
He's still a popular guy.
Yes, he's still very popular, and that's again going back to propaganda. I really cannot understand how it's done, and probably someone should learn from this example, not to repeat it, of course. But still, he has popularity. Although there are more and more people who are trying to, as it's already been said, to not to take that much information into, and they don't want to know what's going on, but they do believe that it's a special military operation somewhere, and President Putin is in charge, and he will take care of it. And if it needs be, we will somehow get through this, and maybe some reforms or even, again, repressions might be needed, but still there is trust in Putin.
All right, and I'm haunted by something you said earlier in the conversation, Alexandra. You talked about you talked about the fact that, well, Russia is a nuclear state, and the head of the UN's nuclear energy watchdog this Monday claims that despite it all, despite this position where there doesn't seem to be any whiff of a chance of compromise at this point, Russia and Ukraine are both interested in a protection zone around Zaporizhzhia. Rafael Grossi of the IAEA speaking after a weekend phone call between Vladimir Putin and his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, a phone call that, according to the respective transcripts, included clear tensions over the continued fighting around Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. According to the Kremlin's version of the call, Putin drew attention to the regular Ukrainian attacks on Zaporizhzhia, including a radioactive waste storage facility, which is fraught with catastrophic consequences. That's the accusation. These were the accusations you saw when you were reporting at Zaporizhzhia, James, Andre.
Yeah, it was very, very complicated to understand what's going on exactly at Zaporizhzhia, simply because the Russians have been controlling it since March. That indeed there are, there is reports, because you can't access on either side. I mean, when we were there, they closed down Nikopol, which is a city which is just on the other side of the Dnieper River. So we tried to access Nikopol, but that we were stopped by the army, who simply said the perimeter was closed, and then it remained closed until the end of the IAEA visit. So we couldn't access Nikopol. But yes, obviously what's been happening is that there's been artillery fired from one side to the Dnieper River to the other, in both directions, with the Ukrainians accusing the Russians of using the power plant as a shield so that there couldn't be any retaliation. Some people also talking to us about combat helicopters being used by the Russians firing on Nikopol in that area, and indeed making it very difficult to retaliate without hitting the power plant, and the Russians accusing the Ukrainians of firing at the power plant. But very, very difficult to understand exactly what was going on when we were there. And indeed, this is this mission by the nuclear watchdog, which has one great result for a start. It means that there are international observers at the power plant watching, which makes it a lot more difficult either to fire from the power plant, but also to fire at it. So, that was obviously, as Grossi said himself, he said the difference between having someone and not having someone is like night and day. But that does mean that the international community has eyes there. The question mark now is, will the Russians accept a demilitarized zone? Because that de facto would mean handing the power plant back to the Ukrainians. And with another big question is, do the Russians want to cut it off the Ukrainian power grid and plug it into Crimea and their own power grid? Of course, it is a strategic asset. It's the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe.
Alexander Rodnyansky, over the weekend, the Ukrainian electricity authority deciding to shut it down entirely for the time being with the volatile situation and the continued fighting. What's the outcome that's possible at Zaporizhzhia? Could it become a demilitarized zone? Do you see a possibility for a compromise like the compromise that we saw that enabled Ukrainian grain exports to leave by boat from Odessa?
Well, I very much hope so. We very much hope so. And I would just like to say, commenting on the previous discussion just now, I think we're giving the Russians a bit of too much of the benefit of the doubt. Remember, it's us who are asking, it's the Ukrainian side that was calling for an international expert organization and for the international community to intervene, to step in, to go to the nuclear power plant, which the Russians didn't let them do until some time. It took a lot of effort for that to happen, to make sure that nothing is actually, that the situation doesn't become worse, right? So that no disaster, no nuclear disaster is essentially around the corner. So look, I mean, obviously it's the Russians that were trying to provoke the West into some sort of pressure on Ukraine. They were trying to play this nuclear blackmail card, as they did in previous episodes, in order for the West to get scared and then make some move on Ukraine, essentially forcing us into submission or into some negotiations or into some deal that would be, essentially would entail giving up on some territory. So that's what the Russians were trying to achieve, I guess, and I hope they didn't. But let's not fool ourselves and think about the situation as some sort of, two sides to an issue type of play, right? I mean, there's really no two sides here. It's the Russians playing nuclear blackmail in the 21st century. That's exactly what's happening. And of course, we weren't bombarding or attacking the nuclear power plant ourselves. I mean, why would we do it? We don't have a strategic military interest there right now. We have other areas that we're concerned with that we already discussed. And we were trying to avert, by all means, a nuclear disaster.
General Yakovlev.
Yeah, one point to be said on who is firing at who. One thing is sure is that the IAEA has seen military vehicles in the on site, and they shouldn't be there. Period. Second thing to be said is that Russia, as the occupying power, is ultimately responsible in international law for what happens there. So they can say what they want. Ultimately, it's their own fault. Now, that said, when you mention demilitarization, I don't see why it would imply immediately reoccupation by the Ukrainians. The deal normally is, you do, I don't know, 20-kilometer radius around, and both sides pledge zero military presence and activity in that. Now, ideally under some international supervision, which is another issue, but of itself, having the Russians agree to demilitarizing does not necessarily mean not occupying. It means occupying without weapons, basically. Not the same story. Right. And it's on the other side of a large river, by the way.
Is it more? Yeah, you heard James Andre mention the fact that you now have that permanent UN presence. Is it just as dangerous as it was before?
Well, I hope not, but to the degree that these two personnel are actually in contact with the outside world.
And allowed to actually see what they need to see. Yeah. But what I mean is that when it comes to, if you are, Russia occupying the power plant, taking your military personnel out and basically handing the power plant back to the... I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it does mean for them they stop occupying the plant, which I imagine in their plans would not exactly be... You believe they can occupy it, carry on occupying it under international supervision when they are illegally occupying the plant?
I mean, they could retire their weapons,
the weapons,
out of
for sure,
and just keep a police type force, light weapons which do not fire across the river, basically.
Yeah,
that's demilitarization enough.
All right. There's the question over Zaporizhzhia. There's the question over the fact that we're talking about, again, a nuclear power, like Kobzev.
Yes, and this is where I think also there should be. We should see this on a greater political and diplomatic scale, and this is where the West or any other country in the world that could be affected by nuclear fallout if something happens should really get tougher on the Kremlin and say, look, so far we were not involved. Call us weak if you want to, but here just for our own survival we will have to get tough. We cannot, for our own survival, run the risk of whoever is involved, you'll say that it's the Ukrainians' fault, it doesn't matter, you're there, you started this, you're responsible for this. And we will
Who are you referring to specifically? Which countries?
I would say, NATO countries, definitely. United States, France, all of the European countries, the European Union. They should get together and really send a very strong message, unless it's done already confidentially, I don't know. But if it's not, they should really send a message to Moscow saying, you are threatening us now. It's not so far. Ukraine is not a NATO country, so we haven't intervened. But this, just for our own survival, we will have to intervene if there's a risk there. If you are risking, if you are taking the risk of us being victims of nuclear fallout that could be worse than Chernobyl, which, by the way, countries in Western Europe, including France, were victims of. That was very much hush-hush, not to embarrass Gorbachev. They could say this time we're not going to be we're not going to cover this up and let you do this. We will have to maybe also intervene militarily for our own protection and not just sending weapons to Ukraine, but going one step further.
Alexander Rodnyansky, the fact that you have the likes of France's Emmanuel Macron, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, that keep the lines of communication open. How do you feel about it?
We think it's useful when the occasion is right. Ultimately, we are also for a dialogue. We don't want dialogue to be completely capped. But at this point, when it comes to direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, there's a problem, because after everything that we've seen them do, all the war crimes that they've committed, the rape, the looting, everything, the destruction, it's very hard to talk about, a return to even the status quo of 23rd of February 2022. So, we're in the middle of a war, a full-scale war, and we'll be focusing on that. But ultimately, we do recognize that over the long run, there will have to be some sort of settlement, some sort of peace treaty, hopefully, when we'll be able to restore, after we restore our territorial integrity in its fullest. And then we're interested in having talks with Russia, also directly and with the rest of the global community, in order to ensure that we have a stable, long-lasting, peaceful solution to this.
Alexander Filipenko, it's day 200 of the war in Ukraine. You were speaking with us here in the France 24 debate when it all began. Your thoughts on what is another turning point, perhaps?
Oh, yes, and I'm very happy now. I can speak much freer, let's say, when in comparison to those first days when I wasn't back in Moscow. Yes, of course, I believe that it is a turning point, and psychologically, first of all, it's a turning point. And the fact that Z channels, again, those propaganda channels, they were so silent for the whole day when Ukraine was taking city by city, means that they really didn't expect this, and they didn't know what to say, and they didn't receive the information from the Kremlin. How must they react? So this really means that they were struck, and this definitely means a turning point. So that is why I believe that even for Russians, although, again, I'm sorry for being pessimistic, but Russians really do not receive a lot of information, and they mostly receive information from propaganda. But still, even for those Russians, they still get the sense, and they get what is going on. And again, since Russian Defense Ministry decided to talk about monuments and restoring monuments, that also sends a signal. They didn't know what to say. They couldn't say anything while Ukraine was taking city by city. So this psychologically, I think, is a turning point.
Michel Yakovlev, we're out of time, but I want to ask you, we've put the emphasis on the problems within the Russian chain of command, the problems of organization, the problems they've had on the battlefield. How much, a lot's been made on the other side about these weapons coming in, particularly those missile launchers, those HIMARS the Americans have sent. Are those the main factor, or is it more Russia's undoing?
Good question. I don't know. They are very important factors. The fact that the Ukrainian army could actually win the fight for fires has been absolutely decisive. I don't think they would have achieved that without HIMARS and more ammunition in particular. So they have been very decisive. There's also what they've invented, drone guerrilla warfare, That's been instrumental and, in trickles. But the real turning point was after Kyiv, when the Russians when they broke the plan. And from then on, Russian soldiers' morale has gone down. And Putin has expended his soldiers' blood. He treats them like cattle. Mm-hmm. And what we see now is that cattle is giving up.
It's all about morale.
HIMARS have helped, but ultimately it's when they failed the first time, that was the first turning point. And now is the second, whereby the Ukrainians are actually now calling the shots.
Michel Yakovlev, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Oleg Kopsev, James Andre. I want to thank Alexander Rodnyansky for joining us from Kyiv, Alexandra Filipenko in Vilnius. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.